I just love how this podcast and this space that we're holding with Gratitude Blooming is such a place for synchronicity to arise. And Christine, we have quoted you several times throughout our podcast for the stories that you've shared with us. And how did Gratitude Blooming show up in your life, and how is it alive in you right now for our listeners who are so curious to find out how all the threads are connected?
A couple of days ago, I pulled from the deck, and the community card, the bleeding heart. You mentioned these synchronicities where I had been thinking like, okay, where is my path going? I'm currently a PhD student in education, and I'm just about to finish writing my dissertation proposal. And so there's a lot of like sort of anxiety around how that process is going and the unknown of what will happen next. And I've been thinking about like the community that has supported me through this process. And just by happenstance, an old friend of mine called yesterday, and this is like my old roommate from college. We talked on the phone for like an hour, and we hadn't like spoken for like years. So I feel like whenever these cards come up or happen, there's always something that, I don't know, the universe or life or whatever, just it aligns and just sends messages. And so I feel like, yeah, on the surface, that's sort of where Gratitude Blooming has been with me these past few years.
And you were getting your PhD, or were you getting your master's degree originally when you first reached out to us?
Yeah, I was in the very beginning stages of my PhD. I want to say maybe year two. Yeah.
Wow. And what is your dissertation topic, if I can ask?
Yeah, well, it's changed. So when I think the first time I wrote, the both of you, I was in this transition of, trying to figure out topics. And before graduate school, I was working in the resettlement sector as a program coordinator and like a teacher. So I was working with newcomers and, refugees primarily. And my work had, like in the beginning stages of grad school, focused on in immigration education. And then after the pandemic and going through the sort of twists and turns of grad school in that specific time period, I just stumbled upon other things, and I found myself really wanting to understand. And I feel the podcast has touched on this, like how are we going to move forward, together as people. And specifically, my dissertation is what I hope to propose is this idea of what does reciprocity look like in how it primarily about program evaluators, how that emerges in their practice. So
Reciprocity.
Yeah, the concept of reciprocity. So what does that look like when, you're working together with the community or different people within a program as you're trying to understand and evaluate the program?
And how do you define reciprocity yourself? This is such an interesting thread. I would not think of reciprocity and program evaluation in education as connected things. So it's very unique the way that you're building a frame around it. So yeah, curious, what is your sense of it as you're uncovering it through this process?
It was definitely something that emerged in the pandemic when in our graduate program, we had to connect, everybody had to connect online, right? And so many of us found that, a lot of our working spaces were in person, and trying to find community was like very difficult. My graduate student colleagues, the three of us identify as like Filipino American, and we were finding that in that process of going through graduate school that we just had so many more common threads in our experiences. And there's this concept in Filipino culture called, there's two different concepts. There's one called kapwa that talks about like community, and that there's like the shared sense of self, and there's this other like shared sense of inner self. So like you're still looking at yourself as an individual, but still connected to like the collective. And then there's this other concept called utang na loob, which previously means like debt of gratitude. And, you know, with that framing, it's like, is it a debt or is it what? And so my colleagues and I, we were really curious to see what that looked like in our practice as, you know, we identified as Filipino American, and whether those, you know, concepts, if they drive like what we do in education as researchers and evaluators, or in my case, like a, you know, program evaluation scholar. And so, you know, we came to redefine debt of gratitude more like, oh my goodness, what do we call it? More like a gift rather than it being a debt, because that's also connected to, you know, these ideas of you know, like settler colonialism and being in debt to somebody rather than it being like a shared sense of, you know, a shared sense of self. But even then, it's not like even. There's like this other deeper meaning where, you know, that connects also to the community. And so I'm still unpacking all of that.
I love your focus on reciprocity and that link between community and gratitude. You know, I'm obsessed with kind of new forms of currency and how do we share, like what is that collective economy and culture. And I had the opportunity recently to talk with this guy, Will Rudda, former Peace Corps member physicist, who's working in Kenya, and he created a local script or currency that now 64,000 Kenyans are using. And, you know, one of the things that he talked about is at the beginning of any economy is a promise or a commitment. And so how do we represent that promise or commitment? And so one form of representation is like money or currency, but he also says, you know, it can be a voucher. You know, an airline mile point is a form of, you know, currency. Starbucks loyalty rewards, right? Like we have these different ways that we can represent our promise or commitment in an exchange. And I feel like that's what you're really kind of unpacking is what is that promise and commitment that we have to each other. And really reciprocity is when there's an exchange, right? There's a flow, there's a movement. You know, we have another, one of my friends, and he's been on our podcast, Taj James, and he talks about currency, like there's clouds, which hold capital, then there's rain that sort of drops down, and then there's rivers that move capital, and then there's communities that live around the lakes. And so, you know, capital works when there's flow. But when we put dams and things in there, it stops the reciprocity, it stops the community, it stops the relationship. And so, yeah, I'm excited to sort of see where you go with this.
One of the things that we are starting to find, at least with the Filipino Americans, is that when we define utang na loob, it's not just transactional, right? It's more than that. It's an exchange, but it's like deeper. It's like tied to the spirit and the heart and that idea of community. And so I think that's where I've been trying to like unpack that piece, because it's like we do live in a capitalistic society, yet we're finding that certain things aren't sustainable anymore.
I love that it goes back to the community card that you talked about from the beginning. It's threading itself through, like how do you give and receive in ways that feel life-giving. That's kind of how I like to look at reciprocity, is like how what is that feeling where there's no depletion on any of the sides. And that's a lot of what Omar, Arlene, and I are thinking about is, you know, as a team, how do we work together? And then as an organization that's holding space for a larger dialogue and community and conversation. How is that flow? What is the energy of that? How do we make that coherent? And so I'm curious, as we kind of go into the practice of gratitude blooming in this moment, is there a question or an intention that is most alive in you for this season of your life? And it can be something really connected to what you talked about with your research, or something more personal in terms of where you're at, even in this transitional place of, at some point you will complete your dissertation and you will, take the next step to decide what is how is this work going to live in the world, in you. So in this moment in your heart, what is the question or the intention that you would like to receive insight around?
My heart is telling me that it has to do something more with the heart. I think being so embedded right now in this process is that can oftentimes be grueling. Is, I suppose, how can we continue to open our hearts when things get really difficult?
What I hear you saying is really, how do we keep the humanity front and center in everything that we're doing? And, just as you were talking, I've recently come across, it's called the TIMN model of like social kind of structures, right? And the T is tribes, I is sort of institutional. You think about nation states or, hierarchical, churches or something like that. M is now kind of more market-based, or platforms like PayPal or Facebook, or, how we're engaging through these algorithms, really. And the sort of emerging model is around networks. And networks are much more interrelated. And in some ways, there's a lot of elements of tribal, right? Like it was just sort of much more relational kind of elements, which worked at a certain scale of geography, but was hard to grow. But now with technology, maybe there are ways to reconnect at a global scale, but in a still more intimate way. And so it's been interesting to sort of look at the evolution of societies, right? From tribal to institutional to market to now networked. And then how does reciprocity evolve, in those ways? And what is the new reciprocity that is possible if we're reorganized in a way that centers humanity, that centers humanity in a way that also recognizes ecology and, like something that all of these things are interconnected and we can't separate, one from the other.
So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to just express that intention that you held. Just, how do I stay heart open, especially when things, are maybe challenging in your life or in all your relations? You could tell me when to stop or just give me some numbers. See what randomness, synchronicity has to tell us.
Ooh, I'm coming up with the fourth row and the fourth card, maybe?
Number 10, Alium Triquetrum, self-care. What can you do today and every day to nurture love for yourself? So as you start, first, just really focus on the art and just describe what you see without, even interpreting it relative to your intention.
I'll never get this card. This is probably, I think, the first time I saw this card in all of when I pick randomly and in the whole time I've been working with the deck. And that said, I've never had a chance to really look at the art on it. And it's just so interesting. It's like, I have no idea what an Alium triquetrum kind of flower is. And it just looks so bare right now, a little bare and like in need of love. There's like 4 flowers just kind of hanging down, and yeah, just maybe need to take a step back. 10, when I think of number 10, I don't know, I always think of like a new set. And so starting over and moving into like a new number sequence, I suppose. And so, yeah, I guess it also resonates with me because I think I do need a little self on my end. Yeah.
Yes, now as you look at the theme of self-care and your intention of like how do you bring more heart into what you're doing, what comes up for you?
Yeah, I recently was talking to some colleagues we have these writing groups that we spend time in holding ourselves accountable online, and they've kind of continued from the pandemic until now to, these are like a group of friends where we like hold each other accountable to getting through our program. And I was just sharing with them earlier today how I've been trying to, with time, if I'm able to have the free time to focus on the things that I used to love doing. So I started to pick up tennis again, which I used to do back in high school. And so I'm excited because I'll be meeting with some folks later today to play some tennis. So I think that's one of the things is also just doing the things that I really love and that bring joy. So
I super appreciate the connection to reciprocity here, as I look at this for myself too, because it's like how much you can give really depends on how much you nurture yourself. I feel, working on land, there's a constant potential to overextend very physical work, but also just seeing everything like a project that needs to happen. And I used to be a classroom teacher as well. So I remember the job in education was you always would lose yourself in the mission and realize like after a really hard week, it's like, oh my gosh, I have zero left in the tank, like none. And even like going to yoga was like energy, driving through traffic to get to this class on time, and so it's just an interesting concept is like how much we can authentically give in a way that doesn't like hurt us. It really depends on this self-care question.
And I love your reminder of joy. I think we totally underestimate the importance of things that don't, even if they're important, you don't have to be serious about everything, right? Like joy really, is part of being human, right? Like, and this is, also the sort of biology is like the brain already has the bias for the negative, holding on to pain and difficulty. And so part of humanity is like, how do we disrupt ourselves and allow joy to really be part of the medicine, right? Like part of the reciprocity.
I think one of the things that part of self-care too is taking the time to just even reflect, not just do something for yourself, but also reflect on the things that, like a theme that's been coming up for me recently is like, and I think this came from one of your podcasts just recently, perhaps with Susie, like what are the things that you could let go of, and can you make peace with some of the choices that you've made because of, making a choice of getting into that situation or whatever before? How can you, let go of the things that no longer serve you? And, one of the other themes in the last podcast I remember is like, how can that also, I don't know, reharmonize the life that you're living? And I think of that as self-care being part of that process.
I just looked up the etymology of reciprocal, and re is back, and then pro is forward. And so it's just reciprocal is back forward. And I think about, time, right? Like, how do we acknowledge everything that has happened before us and also everything that is yet to happen? And then I feel like humanity is like, how do we bridge the past and the future, right? Like, how do we hold that sort of space for now. And part of that is self-care, right? And part of self-care is community. And that you realize that, this is again why we love gratitude, is that gratitude is this bridge between self-care and caring for others, right? Like we can do a better job of caring for others when we take care of ourselves, and when we are in community with other people, we are better taken care of. And, and I think that it breaks that like us versus them, that separation, right? So the word reciprocal is like, hey, it's back and forward. It's not one or the other, right? You got to be able to hold one in the left hand and the other in the right hand, and recognize they're all part of the same body.
So with that, Christine, I'm going to invite you I'm going to go to the bottom and I'm going to move my cursor up, and I invite you to pick a card for our community. Everyone that's watching and listening, what is the card that they most need right now for their own well-being?
Maybe stop.
Okay, and then is there a particular card in this row?
I was looking at the one just right above to the right of the cursor.
Like here?
Yeah, that one.
Card number 31, Gardenia, representing gentleness. Being kind to yourself and others can be a way to show gratitude. What would it look like to live with more gentleness?
I don't think the world is gentle enough. I feel like being kind is something that folks take for granted. And I don't know. I don't know. I feel like this is just my opinion. That if we are able to just have a little bit more kindness in the world, I just wonder what, that would do for our community and humanity.
It always puts my heart at ease seeing this card, because it does feel very gentle, the way that the petals spiral, from the inside out. So that to me is like also a reminder of like, take care of yourself, be kind to yourself first, and then it'll ripple out. And the way that Arlene writes this word in cursive just feels really gentle. Like, the way that she writes every single one has a subtly different energy. And so I'm just appreciating the way it's making me feel just looking at it. It's like the petals are looking at us straight on almost, and we can see it from kind of a slightly bird's eye view, it feels like. So soothing.
I was in a meeting yesterday with a group that attended our empathy and democracy event, and they wanted to learn a little bit more about our work and our podcast, because they focus on equity and justice in Long Beach. And we pulled this card, and and I think for me, I was really reflecting on what we see depends on where we stand. So the perspective of this picture is like the bird's eye view. And, if you're a worm, you're seeing something very different, right? You're seeing the stalk and the leaves, which are really hidden from this angle. And I think gentleness is just the reminder that, we all hold different points of view. And none of us can have a complete picture. And so really, how do we create room to listen to each other better, and see the world in a more holistic way? And I think just with this conversation around reciprocity and community is, the gentleness required to realize that everything's an exchange, and like, how do we make room for each other?
That's so beautiful, Omar. And should we share the song for gentleness for people that are less visual and more auditory? I love that we now have our second album, and we're halfway through having a song for each card.
Yeah, we have 2 albums now, Garden of Healing and the Garden of Joy. And we were debating whether or not we wanted to play Community from the second album, which is The Garden of Joy, or Gentleness, which is on the first album. And we're going to be having our third album dropping this fall in September. And so, yeah, we're 2 albums away. So I think we're going to go with Gentleness. And this is going to be a new segment on the podcast where we're going to invite the cards to pick a song for us to listen to. And, maybe Belinda will share a few grounding words before or after we play the song. Which one do you want to do?
Let me set it up before we listen. Just invite you to bring your presence to the essence and the feeling of gentleness, and just planting your feet on the ground if you can, just letting yourself be rooted in this present moment, and taking a couple breaths to just arrive and be available to the song and medicine of gentleness through this music. May you receive gentleness for yourself and with others this week.
Backwards and forwards, up and down, all around. Thank you, Christine, so much for joining us. Thank you for our listeners. We appreciate you. You can listen to all of our music on our website, gratitudeblooming.com, or wherever you listen to music. Cheers.
Cheers.